Aloha, I'm Diane Wilson from the Hawaii Writers Guild. Welcome to Write On, a series of videos with tips, instruction, and inspiration for all of you writers out there. Today's episode is focused on something many of us struggle with. While it may not be exciting, it's very important to our writing, and that's punctuation. Because of the volume of information about punctuation, we've split this particular episode into two different videos. Leading today's session is Fojtasek. Welcome, Anne. Can you please give us a little information about your background?
Okay, I started out as a storyteller when I was very young because my mother used to tell us stories, and it soon dawned on me that if I was the one telling the story, I could make the story come out the way I wanted to. That led to an interest in writing, and that in turn led to an interest in learning how to get my stories down on paper in the most correct form possible. By the time I was in high school, I was already really interested in writing. I got a master's degree in English literature, and then I was one of the original founders of the Kohala Mountain News. And for 10 or 12 years, I was both the layout editor and the copy editor for the newspaper, which was wonderful practice for me because a lot of the stories that we got, especially in those early years, were from people who were very shy about their ability to write. Sometimes things would come in where they didn't even have a subject and a verb in the same sentence. So it became part of my job to get all that down as clearly and correctly as possible while still retaining the original flavor of the author's words so that when that person looked at the story, they felt like, yes, this is my story. And at the same time, it was great practice for me.
Can you start off today by telling us why you find grammar and punctuation are so important in writing?
Well, a lot of times it seems to me that people have the idea that studying grammar and punctuation is a very boring and pedestrian part of writing. They feel like it maybe takes away from the time that they could spend being creative. I look at it as being the other way around. I think that when you have good grammar and punctuation, that contributes a lot to your story, to making it come across clearly so that the reader can focus on what you're actually trying to say and not on the mistakes that you're making. When the mechanics of writing are well managed, the reader can focus on the dynamics of the story or the article. And remember, if you submit a story for consideration to an editor and the editor promptly notices a lot of mistakes in grammar or punctuation, he or she may not ever even get to noticing how compelling your story is because they're already focused on the mistakes that you're making.
Okay, good point. So let's begin by talking about commas. I chose that as the first subject because I personally struggle with overusing commas, and I know that there are others out there who have either the same or the opposite problem. What is the appropriate time to use a comma?
Well, I will say that it seems like as time goes on, the fashion is becoming to use fewer commas than we used to use. Many people use too many commas. When we're writing a sentence that has two independent clauses, a subject and a verb in each clause, the rule is to put a comma between the two clauses. But if the second clause has no separate subject, to not use a comma. So I've given a sentence here. He jumped into his car and he raced down the hill. You would put a comma between the two. But if you simply said he jumped into his car and raced down the hill, and you're not restating the subject, then you wouldn't use a comma. Now, I've noticed that more modern usage might eliminate the comma between the two independent clauses, particularly if they're short and succinct. But I think that the second example, where you don't have the restatement of the subject in the second clause, would not take the comma. I think that rule is still pretty standard and we probably should keep with it. Let's see. I frequently will see two independent clauses with no conjunction between them, just a comma. Here's an example. He told me to come on time. I told him I would, with a comma between the two. That's known as a run-on sentence or a comma splice, and that's not a good thing to do. You should either break it into two sentences. He told me to come on time, period. I told him I would, or put a comma and a conjunction in between the two. He told me to come on time and I told him I would, or he told me to come on time, comma, but I said I could not, or something of that sort. And that gets around that problem of the comma splice. Of course, we use commas to set off words in a series. In this sentence, apples, oranges, peaches, and pears filled the basket. We have a series of different words, the apples, oranges, peaches, and pears. The old rule said to put a comma after each one until the conjunction, apples, comma, oranges, comma, peaches, comma, and pears. But the newer rule often eliminates that last comma, so it would be apples, comma, oranges, comma, peaches, no comma, and pears filled the basket. I would say that putting the comma after the last item before the conjunction is not incorrect, but it sounds like a little more modern usage not to put it there. Commas, of course, are used to set off introductory or explanatory phrases. When I glanced out the window, comma, I saw the workman had arrived. When I glanced out the window is an introductory phrase, so it would need to be set off by commas, although if it's very short, there are times when you could probably eliminate that comma. And my sister, comma, an artist for many years, comma, recently had a successful exhibit of her work. The phrase an artist for many years is an explanatory phrase modifying my sister, so that should be set off by commas. And you'll notice if you read the sentence out loud, my sister, an artist for many years, recently had a successful exhibit of her work. You naturally tend to put a comma there just in the way you read it, because the comma represents the space of a breath, and that's the place where you would naturally take a breath. Generally speaking, there should never be a comma between the subject and the verb unless there's something else in between the subject and the verb that needs to be set off by commas. So I gave an example here of two sentences. The first one, the nurse knew immediately what ailed her patient. Nurse is the subject, knew is the verb. You would not put a comma between the two. But if you put in an explanatory phrase between the subject and the verb, the nurse, experienced in diagnosing illness, knew immediately what ailed her patient, then that explanatory phrase, experienced in diagnosing illness, would of course be set off by a comma. I have to say that there are rare instances where you might need a comma between the subject and the verb simply for clarity. And I will admit, I thought I could not come up with a good example, but I know I have seen examples, it does happen. But for the most part, you don't want to put a comma between subject and verb unless there's other material in there, another phrase or something that needs to be set off by commas. Modern usage generally calls for fewer commas today than what was used in the past. If you have a sentence with a lot of commas in it, I would say it's a good practice to go over it and see how many commas you can eliminate without changing the meaning. Because if you have one phrase after another set off by commas, it can be either clumsy or tedious or both. So see what you can do with it.
Thank you. I need all of those suggestions. You mentioned in one of your previous examples where a semicolon could have been used. Let's talk a little bit about colons and semicolons. What are the rules about the correct use of each of those?
Okay, a semicolon is a harder break than a comma. There are many places where you could actually break the sentence. Instead of putting a semicolon, you could actually put a period and make it into two sentences. The reason for using a semicolon is because the semicolon suggests a relationship between the two clauses. You generally have two independent clauses set apart by a semicolon. I've given us an example here. Rain pounded my yard into mush, semicolon. I wondered if my garden would break loose and float away. Now you could actually break that into two sentences and just put a period after rain pounded my garden into mush. The reason for using the semicolon there is because that makes it clear that there is a relationship between the two phrases. And you'll notice that both phrases essentially say, it was really raining hard out there. The other main use for a semicolon is to separate items in a series when each item is longer than can comfortably be set apart by commas. Like in that sentence up above where we had items in a series, apples, oranges, peaches, and pears filled the basket. Each of those items is just one word long. And if you had items that were even like 2 or 3 words long, that would probably still be okay with a comma. But what if you had a sentence where each of the items was pretty complicated, a whole clause? An example would be, she gave us a list of her grievances. We weren't taking her seriously enough. We were interrupting her before she could finish her requests, and we failed to listen respectfully when it was her turn to speak. I've set those 3 items aside or apart by semicolons because each of those items is actually a full independent clause. The semicolon just makes it a little bit more clear. It helps you, it forms a break between the items and helps you keep it straight what's part of one item and what's part of the next item in the series. Now, colon essentially says, this is what I mean, or here's an example. So if you look at the above sentence, she gave us a list of her grievances, colon, we weren't taking her seriously enough, and so on. The colon separates a list of her grievances, and then here's the actual list.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to ask on that one. So if you use the colon in that way, where there are a list of grievances, do the grievances then have a semicolon between them or a comma between them?
No, I would still use the semicolon if the semicolon was appropriate there anyway.
Okay.
It wouldn't change simply because they come after the colon.
Okay.
Of course, there are many places where we use a colon where we probably don't even think about it, like in a time signature. We'll meet at 3 o'clock, 3:00, or after a salutation in a letter, dear sir, colon, or if you're listing chapters and verses of a Bible verse, you would put the number of the chapter, colon, and the number of the verse. Most people don't have a problem with that. That's pretty standard usage.
I think we've got time for one more, and I know one of the issues people have is with hyphens and dashes. How are they different from each other, and when should we use each?
Okay. A hyphen is basically a connecting device. We often see them in compound words like 100, son-in-law, bad-tempered, forget-me-not, looker-on. Those are all examples that are hyphenated. Quite often what happens is that 2 words come to be used together a lot. So we start to associate them. And then as a result, they start to be written together with a hyphen. And then eventually, if they're used enough, they may actually be written all as one word. And the truth of the matter is there are so many compound words, thousands and thousands and thousands, that if you're not sure, what you should do is just look it up. There are a few, or there are probably quite a few compound words that have become standard, and we know that they're written with a hyphen. But if you're not sure if it's written as two words with a hyphen or all as one word, the safest thing to do is just look it up. Another use for hyphens is when you're forming an adjective out of two words that may not normally be used together. Here's an example. We gave each speaker a limit of 2 minutes, would be written without a hyphen. But if you put it, we gave each speaker a 2-minute limit, then the 2-minute becomes an adjective that modifies limit, so that would be hyphenated, 2-minute. And that's something that we see quite a bit, and I frequently find that people leave the hyphens out, so that's something to be aware of. Hyphens are also used to show a break in a word. Of course, we're used to using a hyphen at the end of a sentence when we can't type the whole word on one line. You can use a hyphen in to break a word in dialogue. For instance, if you had a sentence that said, "Yes," she said hesitantly, the yes doesn't sound particularly hesitant. So you could break that by putting ye-es. "Yes," she said hesitantly. In fact, you might not even need the word hesitantly if you wrote it that way, because the hyphen naturally indicates a certain hesitancy there. Or when you're trying to show that someone is stuttering, "I won't do it," someone says, you would have a W hyphen, and so on. And the hyphen can be used to emphasize individual letters in a word. And an example that I found was if you're making a distinction between the word rough and the word cough, even though they both end with O-U-G-H, they have a quite different pronunciation. So if you were explaining that in a sentence, you could separate the letters of the word R hyphen, O hyphen, U hyphen, G hyphen, H, and the same with cough, to indicate that you're putting emphasis on the difference in the way these letters are used. A dash looks similar to a hyphen, but it's not the same thing. As a mark of punctuation, it is usually twice the length of a hyphen, and it is sometimes referred to as an M dash. A dash is used to show an interruption in thought, dialogue, or action. An example of a sentence would be, "I probably shouldn't tell you, dash." "No, I know I shouldn't tell you," she wailed, "but under the circumstances, I can't not tell you." The dash shows that she broke off in what she was saying. It can also be used to emphasize or to set off information that the writer wants the reader to notice. An example would be the signal, dash, a small boy running across the stage in a bright red shirt, dash, told the audience to pay very close attention to the next speaker. Keep in mind that a dash is a strong mark of punctuation and should not be overused.
Thanks so much, Anne, for sharing your knowledge with us today. I hope that this has been helpful for both new and experienced writers alike. Please tune in for the next episode where, spoiler alert, Anne will deal with other issues such as ellipsis, which again is one of my favorites. For more information about writing and about the Hawaii Writers Guild, please go to www.hawaiiwritersguild.com and write on.